Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Dr. Katharine Beals. Dr. Beals, how are you doing today?
I am well, and how are you? It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm doing well. It looks like there might be some rain outside, but we're inside, so it doesn't matter. I will give you a proper introduction, and then we will speak on the topic at hand. Dr. Beals has a PhD in linguistics, is lecturer at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, and an adjunct professor at both the Drexel University and Temple University Schools of Education. She is the author of numerous books and articles on language, literacy, math instruction, and problems with current practices in K-12 classrooms. She specializes in language and literacy acquisition in autism, language technologies for autistic individuals, educational challenges for students with autism, evidence-based instruction, and the problems with facilitated communication as an intervention in autism. She has written and lectured extensively on those topics, including the textbook Cutting Edge Language and Literacy Tools for Students on the Autism Spectrum and Students with Autism, How to Improve Language, Literacy, and Academic Success. So once again, welcome and thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Temple University, Drexel University, University of Pennsylvania, you're quite busy, I must say.
Yeah, I like to say that I teach at the 3 urban ed schools in Philadelphia, but specifically special ed, so it's specialized.
And you recently authored an article, Should Schools Dedicate Time to Grit and Growth Mindset? And that's what prompted me to reach out to you, because those are two topics that are of interest to me as well. Hopefully we'll get to facilitated communication if we can. But I want to talk about grit and growth mindset in your article first. So grit and growth mindset, correct me if I'm wrong here though, these fall under a generic umbrella of learning styles, right? So I'm sure most people have a popular understanding of what grit and mindset mean, but the terms have come to be they've come to have a more formal academic definition, right? So before we discuss the article, can you tell me how the terms grit and growth mindset might be used in education settings?
Well, I think it is tricky because grit and growth mindset, especially grit, has sort of been around in the vernacular for a while. But in academia, it seems to amount to something like a combination of conscientiousness and perseverance, and it's supposed to relate to your ability to keep at something that might be frustrating. And then growth mindset, that's more of a term of art that probably hasn't been around that frequently, before it was coined by the person, Carol Dweck, who uses it. And that is contrasted, maybe it's best understood as a contrast to fixed mindset. So growth mindset is when you view yourself as being able to improve your performance or perhaps yourself in various ways. The idea that you're not stuck with whatever your current abilities are, whereas fixed mindset is the idea that you maybe are a little more fatalistic about your abilities and your ability to get better at something.
So you mentioned Carol Dweck, so she I can't even say the word. She popularized, that's it, the growth mindset, fixed mindset concept. And is there a history of grit? Is it the formal usage of that, or is that kind of?
That in academia, that really seems to originate with Angela Duckworth. Before that, people would use terms like perseverance and conscientiousness. And one of the criticisms is that it's not clear how grit is different from ideas that have been around for a while.
Somebody was just able to coin a term and write a book. Maybe that's too, I don't mean to be too flip about it.
It happens.
Okay. I'm going to throw a quote at you from your article. I apologize if you're not familiar with your own work. I don't mean that in a sarcastic way, but sometimes people forget what they write. You can either defend this or say, I've changed my mind or whatever you want. But it's just also to set up the conversation here. So you wrote, and this is kind of paraphrased, you wrote that in a culture that has long prioritized psychological health and emotional intelligence over academic achievement, the notion that enhancing social emotional mindsets enhances learning is decades old. So just to be clear with that, you're not implying the complete opposite, right? That there's no connection between social and emotional health and learning.
Oh, absolutely not. I think there are connections between lots of things in learning, like whether or not you're well fed and whether or not you're stressed out, distracted by things. So absolutely, there are all sorts of things that have an effect on learning.
Let's dive now into the popularity and the acceptance of the grit and the mindset concepts, and if they got ahead of the evidence. And in case anyone thinks that's like a harsh question, asking if something is popular before there's evidence to support it, that's not unusual, actually. There are many notions of learning that have become popular without much evidence, and I can rattle off like multiple intelligences, or maybe it was 8 intelligences, the 5 learning styles, the Mozart effect, the self-esteem movement. I mean, as I just alluded to, people may get an idea and write a book, but they don't do much research. I don't know. Do you want to say anything or add or correct or take anything away?
Yeah, I was going to say that all of those are examples of things that are supposed to have some effect on academics that they seem to multiply around. I think I believe there's some sort of like environmental intelligence that has been proposed. So yeah, it's an unconstrained mass of questionable mindsets and styles that it's not clear where they're coming from, and they don't seem to be based on actual a priori kind of experiments, or it's not really clear where they're coming from.
This this part of the conversation might be startling to any parents listening that just accept, because that's what they're taught as well, right? So there's also the acceptance of there's the acceptance of what you're taught without questioning it, or just whatever becomes the popular book. So I mean, some people may be bristling already, but this is your field, research in education.
Yes. Right. Yes. And education is full of things like this that people that sort of appeal to common sense or to what people would like to believe, but turn out not to be really based on anything empirical.
All right. Hopefully we'll get to something empirical as we go through here. So, and regarding the evidence around grit, well, we'll get to the evidence later, but you do raise some questions in your article about schools that devote time specifically to grit and mindset skills instead of time dedicated to academics. So let's go through some of the questions that you need to ask there. So regarding grit and growth mindset, I mean, are they learnable? You asked that question. So are they learnable?
Yeah, well, I think it's not clear that they are. Another thing to question is, well, if they're learnable, in what way are they learnable? A lot of things that we learn to do, like learning how to walk and learning how to speak our first language, are learned without people teaching us. They're learned implicitly through the environment. And certainly our personalities develop in the course of being in the world. And so in that sense, you could imagine it's quite likely that someone could become more perseverant or grittier, as Angela Duckworth might like to say, over time. So in a sense, it's learned from the environment. We're a product of the environment. But as far as a teacher teaching it, there doesn't seem to be compelling evidence that is happening.
This next question probably won't make much sense, but we'll ask it anyway. So if we don't know if they're learnable and teachable, I guess if people have an innate grit and growth mindset, do those automatically lead to higher academic achievement?
Yeah, well, that's kind of funny because we're talking about, well, maybe we should have a fixed mindset about whether people have grit. I think that these things are the product of the environment. And so one thing you could ask is, well, maybe there are other things schools could do to foster perseverance. One of the criticisms of a lot of, for example, the math curriculum and also until recently, the reading curriculum, is that it's sort of all over the place and doesn't give you a sense of cumulative learning. And that sort of setup is not going to foster perseverance or growth mindset. So I think that, I don't think we want to think that this is something that people are born with, but I think that we might want to be thinking a little bit more about how we can manipulate the environment to cause individuals to feel more like, I want to keep going and I feel like I can get better.
What shape would that take, manipulating the environment?
In school, it would give you a sense of control over your progress. it would, to take math and as a particular example, because math is very troubled right now, it would mean having a logically sequenced curriculum that is pitched at each student's what's called zone of proximal development, where they are, that is properly instructed with properly demonstrated what are called worked examples of math problems, and then gradual removal of scaffolding so that students learn to do the math problems at a particular level, and then a gradual increase in challenge and gradual systematic introduction to new material. And if you do it that way, then where you're pitching things just above what students are comfortable with, then you are eliminating potential frustration, and you're giving students an opportunity to progress, and you're maximizing the chances that that progress will occur. So that's an example of manipulating the environment.
So it also sounds like in using that example, you come into the direction of causality regarding grit and mindset, because people, well, let me just, I don't know if I can say this like a blanket or generalizable, but it sounds like, as people learn to learn better, they develop more skills in sticking with it.
Yes.
So
you learn that it actually pays off to keep at this, because this is set up in a way that I can see my progress.
it would be implied teaching of grit and growth without dedicating time to it. It just comes through the academic process.
Exactly. And, it could well be that one of the reasons why we're getting so obsessed with grit is that we're seeing students give up because we're using this kind of all over the place, child-centered, student-centered, not very well instructed material.
Well, maybe we can get to that, specifically with math, because everybody knows math, right? So maybe we can get to some of what you're talking about. But before, I just want to back up and say, these are questions that need to be asked when you're trying to establish any kind of objective truth, right? These are forms of questions that any researcher tries to ask and answers, not just in education, but not that education isn't science-based, but or science, medicine, direction of causality, does it exist at all? These are just questions that need to be asked.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's get into some answers now about what does current research show regarding the effect that teaching grit has on academic attainment. So if we assume that it's taught and learned, which it seems like it's a big assumption, but it's kind of entered the popular culture, is there any research that shows that if we do teach grit, it does affect academic attainment?
Not that I've seen, nothing convincing. Even the studies that show that grit itself increases if you teach it are indeterminate. And the one most compelling positive study, which I think was done in Northern Macedonia, if I remember correctly, was a self-rating, like a Likert scale, where students rated whether they felt, more like they were more willing to try hard at things. So that's sort of their only result. And in terms of academics, I haven't seen anything that shows that teaching grit increases math scores, reading scores, that sort of thing.
What about mindset then? What's the research say on mindset? Does that lead to, if it's teachable, if it's learnable, big assumptions, has that been tested and found to lead to greater academic achievement?
That too has been, there may have been one study that showed marginal effects. In general, the issue there was a big meta-analysis that was done, and their finding was that there was a very tight correlation between having Carol Dweck, the originator of the idea of mindset, the promoter of the idea of mindset, as one of the co-authors, and getting positive results. And but in general, very, very small, if any, results in favor of the growth mindset effects.
And again, we can take this out of the education setting. It's not unusual to have an author publish in a peer-reviewed journal with some positive findings, and then other people can't replicate. And then, if you have the right attitude, the original author comes forward and says, "Oh, I guess I made a mistake there. If no one else can replicate," that's in a the most positive world.
Yeah.
But then sometimes people get married to an idea and they just can't let it go. If the research is lacking, how does popularity, not to mention spending, get way ahead of the research? How does that happen?
Unfortunately, I think that a lot of decisions that people make about what works is what kind of makes intuitive sense. And what makes intuitive sense is often a product of what the society as a whole seems to value. And we have a long history of progressive education in this country that dates back to John Dewey, that has sort of de-emphasized the strict academic components of things and placed more emphasis on things that are the so-called whole child. And then the whole child seems to include over time more and more non-academic components that and to some extent these non-academic components just get rebranded with different terms. So you might have had terms like character development in the past, and now you have social emotional learning and grit and growth mindset more recently. But I think this has a long history in our culture, and things will just resonate because they sound right. And I think the intuitive feeling that you get when something sounds right because it's sort of in the culture is hard to distinguish from the feeling that something is right because you actually have seen evidence for it. I think a lot of people just don't make that distinction. And I think that I think most people just aren't particularly empirically minded. They don't think to ask, well, what's the data? Where does this come from? What kind of experiments would have to happen for us to know this?
You're making me wonder, I don't know, maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but I wonder if the schools have taken on too much. I mean, when we're talking academics and teaching academics, is it their responsibility to take on the other aspects of teaching, like character development? And I mean, I that sounds to me like something a very conservative religious person would say, that just teach them reading, writing, and math, I'll take care of everything else. But is it possible that they're just lumping too much stuff in? I don't know if I'm even saying that right, but I think you get my idea.
Yeah, well, schools are being asked to do all kinds of things, and often academics is the thing that suffers. And so then you want to one thing to think about is, well, school is only part of where kids spend their time. They also spend their time at home, and they spend their time, with their family members and with their peers, and out doing things. So what is the best place for what to happen? So what is the best, where should academics happen? Where should character development happen? Maybe character development happens everywhere. Again, there could be ways to manipulate the environment itself to foster character development as opposed to trying to teach it in a kind of propositional advice oriented way, right? There's system 1, there's system 2, right? In the learning theory, and system 2 is all about deliberate thought and deliberate instruction. System 1 is about implicit learning. So that's another aspect. But anyway, I would say that there are two things to think about. One is school the best place for this? Why should schools should not be assuming they're the only environment kids are in. And they should not be assuming responsibility for everything that kids need to have in their general social cognitive repertoire, right? And physical repertoire. And then the other thing is might there be some things that people just learn naturally from being alive that maybe don't need to be explicitly taught in the classroom?
And probably what I'm about to mention right now, I'm sure there's all kinds of trouble with this research. I have not looked into it that much myself, but there's a movement that kids aren't allowed to play freely anymore, right? Everything's scheduled. They can't, and whenever there is a conflict, an adult immediately steps in to try to resolve it. I'm not sure if that's getting ahead of the evidence either, but I mean, that would make popular sense, right? That if kids aren't allowed to free play and to engage in conflict and resolution, they're always going to be hurt by whatever happens. Is
Yeah,
that
I think Jonathan Haidt has written about this in The Anxious Generation, I believe. I haven't read the book, but I've heard him talk about it. And he I believe has some data behind what he says when he says that it's counterproductive to have an adult involved in every time a kid has a conflict with another kid. It's sort of ironic that we're getting rid of some of the more natural character building and emotional and social intelligence building experiences at the same time that we're trying to teach these things in the classroom. So absolutely, I think that kids need to get much more experience than they're getting now dealing with things between themselves and resolving their own conflicts.
you did mention research in education, and it can be difficult. So let's just run through something like that because this is what you do, right? So I mean, at its simplest form, maybe if you want to learn investigate grit or growth mindset. I mean, you could have a class A and class B and the same teacher for both, and the teacher wants to test their hypothesis, right? And maybe it's about mindset. So the teacher may use that intervention in class A, but not in class B, and then analyze the results. But what are some of the obstacles to getting objective results there? I mean, so the teacher, they might even just teach differently, right? The class that they're intervening in, or what are the? How do you develop a generalizable statement about a learning style when there are so many variables within and between classrooms?
Right. It's very hard to do education research. Yeah, and you sort of presented a more ideal scenario where at least you keep the teacher constant. But yeah, the class in which the growth mindset is being quote unquote taught is going to be different from the class in maybe other ways than you expect from the class in which that it isn't being taught. And then the other question I think maybe is even a fuzzier issue is how are you measuring it? How are you going to decide that a kid now has more grit or more of a growth mindset? The studies seem to use surveys, and self surveys are notoriously unreliable. We're not very good at introspecting and rating ourselves, particularly when we're trying to assign some sort of subjective absolute rating to ourselves.
I don't know if I want to mention this or not, but what you're talking about came up recently here in my own town. There was a movement to build one larger school instead of two small elementary schools. And so, of course, there's a big groundswell of people want to keep their small schools. And they, put forth some research to suggest that small schools are better. When I actually looked into the research, it came from Coalition for Small Schools.org. It didn't come from Coalition for Small Schools Help Achievement.org. And then when I looked at their research, it was exactly what you said. It was a bunch of surveys. So they looked at small schools and they gave surveys, and the teachers felt better, the students felt better, they had better attitudes at school. But then I went to the state that this was in, and I went to look at the test scores for the state. I know people have a lot of trouble with test scores, but 75% of the students in that smaller school were not meeting state standards. But they felt better and they had better attitudes. So how do you balance the subjective and what is objective but people have trouble with? Because nobody likes those state standards. The other problem was they were also juxtaposing a small school in a high socioeconomic status area with a large school in a low one. It just seemed flawed from the beginning. And these are researchers, though, introducing all these biases. I don't know if you want to comment on all those problems I just mentioned or not.
Yeah, you certainly see that with, for example, math education research. So people have managed to reach conclusions favorable to what they want to believe by handpicking certain schools to compare with certain other schools. And I think it may not be deliberate. People there are a lot of subconscious biases that occur when a researcher decides how to do the study, which subjects to use, which participants to use, which measures to use, how to implement things, which is why you have to have replication, and which is why generally you find that, for example, studies on which Carol Dweck is a co-author are going to have more favorable results for growth mindset. She may well not be deliberately doing anything to manipulate results, but it's just very hard to eliminate the subconscious bias. And so maybe that's part of what you're seeing. It's hard to know in any particular situation what all is going on in the heads of these researchers. What you said about the small school, the kids had better attitudes, but they had lower scores. That also is an interesting anecdote that you might relate to the growth mindset debate. It suggests that better attitude doesn't mean higher test scores.
Is the quest for an overall theory of learning or approach, I mean, is that going to work? I mean, there's so many variables.
There has been a lot of good work outside of education in the field of cognitive science research, and particularly in the kind of behaviorist world. So we're talking about direct instruction, precision teaching, that is pretty solid on what seems to work better than what. They may not have found the absolute ideal, but there are some common themes that emerge. One of them is that there isn't really such a thing as learning styles, that what works for one person works for another, whether we're talking about typical kids or autistic kids or girls or boys, whatever, the same general principles seem to work. And there's some good data to back this up. There's a big study that most people don't know about called Project Follow Through, in which they found that schools that use these behaviorist informed direct instruction methods get better academic results than schools that emphasize other things. So the common denominator, and if you think about it, it makes sense, but it also has empirical support, is that you figure out where you do a thorough evaluation of a student and you figure out where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then you tailor the instruction to the areas of need, starting with the more basic areas, so perhaps penmanship and phonics, and gradually build up to skills that involve those that are involve combinations of the basic skills, and you drill things until they're automatic. And we understand that that's important when we learn how to play a sport or play a musical instrument. For some reason, we forget that is also effective in education, like when you're learning math or how to read.
Does that have a snappy name, like mindset or grit? So why is it? I mean, how new is that research? Okay, so how new is that research, and how did they support it empirically? So, in other words, did they give a survey, or they have objective measurements? What's going on that makes that research more reliable?
Well, so Project Follow Through was a U.S. government sponsored exploration of a whole bunch of different schools that were either using a direct instruction model or more of a holistic model. And they simply they compared scores on academic tests. And, you can complain about academic tests being problematic, and they certainly are. And we could at some point talk about the SAT and how bad that's gotten. But at least a standardized test can potentially be a good measure. And it's something that's qualitatively different from a self-reported Likert survey where you're expecting people to do what we know people are bad at, which is to introspect and rate themselves. So the way to measure this would be a well-designed standardized test that you use on the intervention group, the direct instruction group, and the non-direct instruction group, for example.
Let me follow up with a socioeconomic question and how to level things out. So when a student gets to school in the morning, or whenever they get there, how do you level the playing field, or the learning field, from a child whose parents have to leave the house before they do because they have to get to work? And they, through whatever reasons, they don't have time to read as much to them, so the kid is on their own. And how do you juxtapose that or evaluate it in terms of somebody that drops their kid off from school? They're there to pick them up. They take them and read a book to them. I'm just making a lot of generalizable things. I don't mean to insult anybody. I had two working parents, and there's the necessity of life here, right, that exists outside of the school, but affects the learning process. So how do you level that? Is that up to the school to look at every individual case and try and work that out, or how does that work?
I think part of it is you have to actually really thoroughly explore where each kid is and where their gaps are, and the gaps could be from gaps in their broader environment, various forms of disadvantage, and you need to make sure you address those gaps. So you don't want to skip over something because you're assuming that all the kids have this exposure, because not everybody does. So that's where it's so important to do careful evaluations of skills and then meet kids where they are. And then I think the other part of this is that all day schools can be a really good idea for some kids. So if the kid parents are leaving at 7 a.m, why not have a school that's open that early and it's open late, with a library, library with people that are around to tutor? That might be a really worthwhile way to spend some extra money. And there may be ways of rethinking some of the other things that money is spent on, so to make that possible. But all day schools, that's something, and also year round schools. So that's something that the mayor of Philadelphia, my hometown, is looking at. Having some schools actually be open during most of the summer. Now, of course, that's not enough. You need to think about what is actually going to happen during those hours. But those two things put together, I think, can do a lot to level the playing field between someone who's coming from a disadvantaged and academically not so nurturing home environment, neighborhood environment, peer environment, and someone who isn't.
And I should say there are a lot of good things happening. So I'm sure this goes way beyond my district, but now there's this breakfast at school.
Yeah.
So students can show up early and have a good meal. And also part of the school is open, I assume, to go to the library and such. I can't guarantee that, but at least you're in that environment. So you're getting the day ready. And so you can have a meal there. I know we do meals through the summer, I think, for people that need them.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of great things going on. When you were talking about the project follow-up, I know in your article you said that sometimes it seems schools are dedicating time to the grit and growth mindset when there are other things flying underneath the radar that are more research-based. Is that what you were thinking, project follow-up?
Project follow-through.
Follow-through.
Yeah. Well, not that the project follow-through is sort of the name of the whole research study, but I'm thinking of direct, explicit instruction pitched to the level that the child is at, and just above that level, that is cumulative and based on reasonable goals for the given subject, right? And I've been recently thinking about boys, because there have been a lot of articles about how boys are in trouble now. They're not doing so well, and there are a lot of boys that are very disaffected, and then they turn into disaffected young men, and just how, thinking back even to my time in school, there were mostly boys who were just not happy with school, and I think they felt like failures. And it's really important to notice when that sort of thing is happening, and again, manipulate the environment and the curriculum and the instruction so that everybody feels like they're being successful. I think that if you set things up so that kids are focused more on their own progress and competing against themselves, their past selves, and making progress, as opposed to looking around and seeing that, oh, I'm not succeeding I'm being given exactly the same thing as someone else my age, and I'm failing and they're doing better. The former is a much better way to address some of these inequalities that kids come to school with.
It seems that, I must say, grit and growth mindset are discredited as metrics. So what do we gain from surveys, these Likert scale surveys? Which Likert scale, you want to say what that is? So people, I'm sure everybody knows, but they might not know the term Likert.
Yeah, it's generally a 5-point scale where it ranges from very much to very little, very much agree, very, very much disagree, that sort of thing. So we've all had those sorts of surveys when we are asked to talk about our latest experience with customer service or whatever. And Yeah. So, and in that situation, in a situation where you're rating how happy you were with a customer service phone call that you just had, that kind of survey can be maybe accurate. But when it's used, it's not clear what role that kind of a survey has in an academic setting, really, where you can measure what matters in more precise ways.
I'm thinking it's a measurement of a sense of belonging or welcomeness or something.
Yeah, I mean, you might be able to find some by looking at student behavior. You might learn more about that. You might learn something by looking at what happens in the cafeteria or the schoolyard. Is someone sitting all by themselves? I think behavior often tells us a lot more than what someone reports about their mindset or their emotional level for the particular day, their emotional thermometer measurement, to use the term from another tool that some schools are buying. Behavior, how we behave, says a lot more. Actions speak louder than words so often.
Even in medicine, research can be done, but it can take a decade or more for research-based results to make it to clinical acceptance or use. All right. If we're talking the same thing in education research, and so grit, growth mindset, learning styles, 8 intelligences, way ahead of the evidence. But clawing back is so difficult because you have to show, oh, it doesn't replicate, so now we need to find something that does. So there's that's one problem. The second problem is if you find something that works in research and it takes 10, 15, 20 years to get down to I'll call it the clinical acceptance, which would be your school, that's almost 24 cohorts of kids. It's 2 generations. How do we speed that up, or is there a way?
I've been reading some of the work of Richard Phelps, who's an education researcher who you might want to have on at some point, who has talked about how actually a lot of this research has been around for a long time. So it's not new. There's a lot of research showing the benefits of direct instruction, pitched at ability level. That has been around. So for example, Project Follow Through, that's from the 70s, right? So I would say the bigger problem isn't that we don't know what works. The bigger problem is combating the other thing that you've observed, which is just the way that somehow uncritically all these ideas about these non-evidence-based ideas about how to teach kids and what should happen in schools, how do we combat those? So it becomes more of a political problem than a scientific problem, more of a psychological convincing problem than a lack of evidence problem, because a lot of the evidence is there.
So an object at motion tends to stay in motion. That would be these faulty theories.
Yes, yes. And a lot of it goes back to the ed schools that the students are taught to, there's a little bit, unfortunately, of a divide, a firewall between the cognitive science research on the one hand and education research on the other. And within the practicum classes that students take at ed schools, and there's a lot of great stuff going on in ed schools, but in the classroom teaching, the students are given arguments for a lot of the student-centered, discovery-based, so-called progressive education premises. And ed schools could be a place where you're taught to look for hardcore evidence, but it doesn't seem to happen. And so you have students that trust what they're being told, and so these things just get with every next generation of students. And again, this can be traced back to John Dewey and his students back in the 30s and 40s, and the Columbia School of Education, actually. So it's just been it has been so entrenched for so long that really is the biggest challenge.
You wrote another article. Sorry, hope I'm not making you reach back here. The problem with math and explaining your math.
Yes.
And earlier in this conversation, you mentioned that there are some problems with math instruction. Can you speak about that? Because it sort of goes along with what we're speaking of.
Yeah. So there are some very influential people coming out of Sanford Ed School, particularly Jo Boaler, who's originally from the UK, but she has been seen as a real guru, and in fact is the one who advised the state of California on its new math standards, and is responsible for the crafting the California math standards, which have diluted the math education to a certain degree. I believe have gotten rid of or reduced the amount of calculus that's recommended in favor of data science. So she's an example of someone extremely influential. And yet, if you look at her actual research, it's very flimsy, and her results don't hold up. But she has a tremendous influence. It doesn't hurt that she's coming from Sanford Ed School, which, by the way, is also where Carol Dweck is. And so people somehow uncritically follow her ideas. And in fact, I think I heard that some people associated with Jeb Bush, who used to be, he's associated with very traditional education. And by the way, unfortunately, this has become a little bit of a Republican Democrat kind of thing, and it shouldn't be that. But anyway, apparently one of his associates has now jumped onto the Jo Boaler bandwagon, and that bandwagon is very much about not teaching the standard algorithms, not drilling kids in math. There's a theory that there's math anxiety and math phobia that's debilitating kids, and there's a notion that everybody can be equally good at math if only you teach things in a certain way. And she very much incorporates the growth mindset into her, not surprisingly, because she's colleagues with Carol Dweck. So again, it's the sort of thing that just seems to resonate with people. It sort of makes sense to a lot of people, and that's good enough. And I think it also maybe in math, I think another thing that might be going on is that I think a lot of people think of math more than any other subject as kind of like a reflection on your intelligence. Like a math test is like an IQ test. And so people can feel really bad about math if they themselves weren't well taught and didn't feel successful. And that can lead to a tendency to want to believe that, we don't really need to teach it in this kind of hardcore math kind of way. Math is not just algorithms and calculus and area under the curve. Math is all this other stuff. And that can make a lot of people feel better about math.
You make me wonder, people entering school with a math phobia, or that there's this thing called math phobia. I wonder how much of that is taught. Math is hard. That's what you learn before you even learn math. Or everybody struggles with this, so don't feel bad. I mean, I'm not sure that's the best reinforcement to give somebody.
No, and it doesn't have to be intimidating. So once again, if you were to carefully evaluate where the student is and where they're kind of running into roadblocks, and address that systematically, just at their level, just above their level, you create a sense of success, and you are kind of hopefully nipping any math anxiety they had to begin with in the bud. The problem is that the way this sort of all over the road, unsystematic, child-centered way we're teaching math, which, by the way, also includes, there's a popular notion out there now, it's been around for a while, called productive struggle. And so kids are supposed to be it's supposed to be good for kids to give them problems that don't have clear solutions that they've seen modeled. That is the kind of thing that will hopefully nip in the bud any math anxiety that the kid is coming in with, right? And so, and what's ironic is that so there are this productive struggle isn't really even math struggle. Like the way in which these math problems are hard, they're not hard mathematically. They're hard because they're full of words, they're full of background knowledge. They might have a whole bunch of different bits of information you have to put together. That's the struggle. Or the struggle might be that you were never shown an efficient way, an efficient algorithm. But they're not really, it's hard to see how this is a productive mathematical struggle. And it's also not clear that struggle is the way to make kids feel better about math and progress, right? So again, I think that the people that are claiming that there's this thing called math phobia that's so debilitating are partially responsible for creating it.
It's funny you mentioned that because I think it was just a couple of days ago I saw this picture going around the internet of a test or a quiz some teacher had given about math. It said, Catherine ate 4/6 of her pizza, Brian ate 5/6 of his pizza, Catherine ate more than Brian. Explain or something. And one of the students wrote, well, Catherine's pizza was bigger, so that's why she ate more pizza. Something I wouldn't have thought to say. And the teacher wrote, wrong. It's not possible. That's the, think this through. And some parent had said, I want to talk to this teacher because the kid had written, maybe her pizza was bigger. That's a good answer.
It is.
It's a really good answer. It's something I use in everyday life, but I would never think about it if I saw it on a test.
Yeah, right. And the funny thing is, I think that's also gone in the other direction. Sometimes that's the trick. And that answer would be celebrated. I've seen that kind of answer celebrated, right? So there might be like, how do you share 4 pencils with 5 people? And the wrong answer is give each person 4/5 of a pencil because, well, that's not, a pencil doesn't work when you break it. And so then then it's wrong to do the math problem, in a traditional way. So, yeah, I think that I would say that a lot of the today's math, the problems are hard in kind of dumb ways.
Oh, that's a good statement. Yeah, they're hard in dumb ways. All right, let me throw something at you. Don't get insulted. But there's somebody watching right now that is stomping around their living room because they've just found out everything they think is true is not. So the question is, I gave you a proper intro, I think, but someone's saying, so Dr. Katharine Beals, what makes you so smart here? How do you know all of this? What's going on? Right? Well, how can I take your,
right?
Is this your opinion or do you know what you're talking about?
Well, I guess I'd be happy to send references people's way. As far as me personally, I've spent a long time in the ed world, partly because of my own kids, but also because I have a special needs child. And when you have a special needs child, you end up noticing more. Special needs children, my son is autistic, tend to be the canaries in the coal mine for problematic practices. And I spent time as a math teacher ages ago. I only did student teaching. I never ended up becoming a math teacher, but I taught in a math classroom for a half year. And so that's where a lot of my math intuitions come from. And then as a linguist, I have been sort of attuned to things that are going wrong in the English and language arts area and language instruction areas as well. So for take it or leave it, but that's kind of where my interest and intensive focus have come from. But don't take my word for anything. There's research that will support, I hope, most of my out and out claims here, as opposed to my speculations.
I will put your website in the description. I will probably also link Creed, which is grit, and McNamara, which was mindset articles. I mean, they're very long articles. Well, actually, the Creed's not so bad, but the meta-analysis is pretty large. But so people can look at it for themselves. And I'll also try and link your Skeptical Inquirer article. I think it's locked. Maybe they'll unlock it. But also your website has a lot of information on it and links to various projects and whatnot. So Dr. Katharine Beals, you have been my guest today on 502 Conversations. Like I said, your website, katharinebeals.com. It's Katharine with 2 A's and Beals. I'm going to show it. I don't know why I'm spelling it. Anyway, and there'll be links, like I said, there. You're also quite involved with facilitatedcommunication.org. That's another treasure trove of information. I'm going to have you back because, as you just said, the canary in the coal mine, that's true for any new mom, right? Going into a Facebook group and finding out a bunch of stuff that's really not true. And as you said, that's, having a special needs child, you get all kinds of information, I'm sure, some good, some bad, that you are in a position to evaluate. So what could be better? All right, we will have that discussion soon, I hope. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been great to be on. Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome.